The morning alarm at Utah Air Force Base pierced the desert silence at 0500 hours, just like every other day for the past 8 years. Avery Knox rolled out of her narrow bunk, pulled her brown hair into the same tight regulation bun, and slipped into her silver maintenance coveralls. At 38, she moved with the precise efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of being invisible. "Morning, Ghost," called out Senior Airman Rodriguez as she passed the hangar entrance. The nickname had stuck years ago, not because she was antisocial, but because she appeared silently to fix problems and vanished before anyone could engage in small talk. She acknowledged him with a brief nod, her noise-canceling headphones already in place. The base was coming alive around her. Young pilots strutted toward the mess hall, their flight suits pressed to perfection, voices carrying stories of barrel rolls and G-forces that made lesser mortals queasy. Avery had heard it all before: the bravado, the competition, the desperate need to prove themselves in a machine that could kill them in a heartbeat. She preferred the company of aircraft systems. Radar diagnostics didn't lie. Fuel gauges didn't embellish. HUD screen calibrations didn't need to impress anyone. Her calloused hands, small but strong from years of wrench work, moved across control panels with practiced intimacy. Knox. The sharp voice belonged to Captain Marcus Webb, a 26-year-old hotshot who graduated top of his flight class 6 months ago. He approached her workstation with his usual swagger, flanked by 2 other young pilots. "Still playing with your toys instead of getting some real flight time?" Avery continued her diagnostic check on the F-16's navigation system, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. The data streaming across her screen showed a minor calibration issue that could cause navigation drift during long-range missions, potentially fatal if left uncorrected. "Maybe she's afraid of heights," laughed Lieutenant Danny Morrison, Webb's constant companion. "Some people are just built for ground work, you know." She felt their eyes on her, waiting for a reaction. The old Avery, the one buried in classified files that only 3 people had ever read, would have turned around and calmly explained that she'd logged more flight hours in combat zones than all 3 of them combined. Instead, she saved her diagnostic report, closed the maintenance log, and walked away without a word. "That's what I thought," Webb called after her. "Some people know their place." As she rounded the corner toward the radar maintenance bay, Avery caught sight of Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski watching the exchange. The 30-year veteran's weathered face showed no expression, but his eyes followed her with something that might have been recognition. He was old enough to remember things that younger airmen never learned. In the quiet of the radar bay, surrounded by humming electronics and the soft glow of monitors, Avery allowed herself a moment to breathe. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear or embarrassment, but from the effort it took to remain silent when every instinct screamed at her to respond. She pulled out her tablet and scrolled through the day's maintenance schedule. Aircraft 870-325 needed a complete avionics check. The fuel system on 8060273 was showing pressure inconsistencies. Standard work for a basic maintenance engineer. Simple problems with simple solutions. Nothing like the complex moral calculus of air-to-air combat, where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home alive or never coming home at all. A knock on the doorframe interrupted her thoughts. Sergeant Lisa Patterson, one of the few women in the maintenance division, stepped inside with a steaming cup of coffee. "Figured you might need this after that display of testosterone poisoning," she said, setting the cup on Avery's workbench. "Those boys really don't know when to quit, do they?" "They're just doing what young pilots do," Avery replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Testing boundaries, establishing hierarchy. It's normal. Normal doesn't make it right." Patterson sat on a nearby stool, her expression serious. "You know, I've been watching you work for 2 years now. Your technical knowledge is off the charts. Sometimes I wonder why someone with your expertise ended up in maintenance instead of flying. The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Avery took a careful sip of her coffee, using the time to construct her standard deflection. Flying requires a certain kind of personality, she said finally. Maintenance requires precision and patience. I'd prefer working with things that don't talk back. Patterson laughed, but her eyes remained curious. Fair enough. But if you ever get tired of fixing other people's mistakes, you might consider putting in for flight training. The Air Force needs good pilots, and something tells me you'd be better at it than those peacocks strutting around outside. If only she knew, Avery thought. If only any of them knew. After Patterson left, Avery returned to her work, but her mind drifted to a small apartment off base where a photograph lay hidden in a dresser drawer. 5 pilots in flight suits, arms crossed, standing in front of an F-16 with Viper Squadron painted on the nose. She was in the center, the only woman, the youngest face, wearing captain's bars. 4 of those pilots were dead now, shot down during a weapons interdiction mission that went wrong in every possible way. Only she had survived, and the guilt of that survival had driven her into 8 years of self-imposed exile. But exile, she was beginning to realize, might not be permanent. Young pilots like Webb made dangerous mistakes because they'd never faced real consequences. They flew with the confidence of immortality, never imagining that the sky could turn from friend to enemy in the space of a heartbeat. As she calibrated the radar system, checking and rechecking every parameter, Avery found herself thinking about preparation, about being ready when the moment came, about the difference between hiding and waiting. The afternoon sun slanted through the hangar windows, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Soon, the day shift would end, and she would drive to her small apartment, eat dinner alone, and try not to think about the dreams that came every night, dreams of blue sky and burning aircraft, of voices on the radio calling for help that never arrived. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she had the strange sensation that her long wait was nearly over. In the distance, she could hear Webb and his friends planning their evening drinks at the officers' club. Stories about close calls that weren't really close. Speculation about deployment assignments that might finally give them a chance to prove themselves. They had no idea that proof, when it came, would arrive without warning and demand everything they thought they knew about courage, skill, and sacrifice. Avery finished her diagnostics and prepared to leave, but something made her pause at the hangar entrance. The F-15 Strike Eagle in Bay 7 caught her attention, a magnificent machine currently in partial maintenance status, its systems powered down but ready for activation. She found herself memorizing its position, its configuration, the access. Codes displayed on the nearby maintenance tablet. Old habits, she told herself. Professional curiosity. But deep down, she knew it was something else entirely. It was preparation for a moment that hadn't arrived yet, but felt inevitable, like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. 8 years of hiding were about to end, though she didn't know it yet. 8 years of silence were about to give way to the roar of afterburners and the deadly precision of a pilot who had never really stopped flying. The last ghost was about to become the first hope. The morning briefing room buzzed with nervous energy as Colonel Hayes outlined the day's training. Missions. Avery sat in her usual spot at the back, officially there to monitor aircraft systems during flight operations, but really there because she couldn't quite break the habit of tracking mission parameters. Alpha Squadron will be conducting close air support training over Sector 7, Hayes announced, pointing to the tactical display. Weather reports show clear skies, minimal wind. Perfect conditions for precision targeting exercises. Captain Webb raised his hand. Sir, Any chance of live fire exercises? We've been running simulations for weeks. Negative, Captain. Today's focus is on coordination and communication. Alpha Squadron has been showing some rough edges in their formation flying. Hayes' tone carried a subtle warning that made several pilots shift uncomfortably. Avery knew what he meant. She'd been watching Alpha Squadron's training flights from the maintenance bay, and what she saw worried her. Their lead pilot, Captain Jackson Torres, was skilled but reckless. His wingman, Lieutenant Rachel Barnes, was technically proficient, but inexperienced in high-stress situations. They flew like a team that had never truly been tested. As the briefing concluded, Webb approached her workstation in the back of the room. "Hey, Ghost," he said, using the nickname with casual familiarity that grated on her nerves. "My bird's been pulling slightly left on takeoff. Nothing major, but I want it perfect for today's run. I'll check the trim tabs and control surface alignment," she replied without looking up from her diagnostic tablet. "Should take about an hour. Make it 30 minutes. I don't want to miss the fun because you're taking your sweet time with a wrench." The dismissive tone was nothing new, but something in his voice today set her teeth on edge. She looked up to find him smirking, clearly pleased with himself for reasons she couldn't fathom. "Is there something else, Captain?" "Actually, yeah. Word around the squadron is that you've been hanging around the flight line more than usual. Getting ideas. Above your station?" His voice carried just enough malice to make nearby airmen pause their conversations. Heat rose in Avery's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "I go where the maintenance schedule requires, sir." "Good, because some people seem to forget that there's a difference between fixing planes and flying them." "Big difference." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Stick to what you know, Knox. Leave the real work to the real airmen." After he left, Sergeant Patterson appeared at her shoulder. "That guy's becoming a real problem. He's been making comments about female personnel to anyone who'll listen. Claims we're all just diversity hires waiting to wash out." "Let him talk," Avery said, but her hands clenched involuntarily around her tablet. "Words don't crash aircraft." "No, but attitudes do, and his attitude is spreading." Patterson's voice carried worry. "Chief Kowalski's been watching the situation. He's not happy about the squadron dynamics." As if summoned by his name, Chief Master Sergeant Kowalski appeared in the doorway. His weathered face was set in hard lines, and his eyes held the kind of concern that came from 3 decades of watching young airmen make fatal mistakes. "Knox, a word." She followed him to a quiet corner of the hangar, away from curious ears. Kowalski studied her face for a long moment before speaking. "I've been in this Air Force since before you were born," he said quietly. "I've seen good pilots and bad pilots, smart airmen and stupid ones. But I've never seen anything quite like what's developing around here. Sir, these young hotshots think they know everything because they can execute a perfect barrel roll in clear weather. They've never been shot at, never had to make life or death decisions with incomplete information, never watched good people die because someone made a mistake." His voice carried the weight of hard experience. "Webb's the worst of them, but he's not alone." Avery remained silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "What worries me," Kowalski continued, "is that they're creating a culture where experience doesn't matter, where asking questions is weakness, where anyone who doesn't fit their image of what an airman should be gets pushed aside." He paused. "That's dangerous, Knox. Dangerous for all of us." "I'm just maintenance, Chief. I fix what breaks and try to stay out of the way." His eyes sharpened. "Are you?" "Because I've been watching you too. The way you move around aircraft. The way you understand systems most pilots never learn. The way you watch training flights like you're analyzing tactical situations." He stepped closer. "Most maintenance techs don't have that kind of instinctive understanding of flight operations. For a moment, Avery felt exposed, as if this grizzled veteran could see through 8 years of carefully constructed invisibility. But she held his gaze steadily. "I take my job seriously, Chief. Understanding flight operations helps me do better maintenance work." Kowalski nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Fair enough. Just remember, Knox, when the real test comes, and it always does eventually, natural ability tends to surface, whether we want it to or not." The afternoon brought routine maintenance work, but Avery found herself distracted by an unusual amount of radio chatter from the control tower. Training flights were being rescheduled, weather reports were being updated more frequently than normal, and there was an undercurrent of tension in the communications that made her increasingly uneasy. Around 1500 hours, Captain Torres and Lieutenant Barnes returned from their training flight looking shaken. She watched from her position near the fuel depot as they climbed out of their aircraft, their usual post-flight banter replaced by serious, hushed conversation. "Did you see how close that SAM simulation got?" Barnes was saying as they passed her workstation. "If that had been real ... It was just a training exercise," Torres replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "We handled it fine." Avery's blood chilled. Surface-to-air missile training was advanced combat preparation, not the routine coordination exercises Hayes had described in the morning briefing. Something had changed, and the change wasn't being communicated through official channels. She waited until the pilots were out of sight, then activated her maintenance access terminal and pulled up the day's flight records. What she found made her stomach drop. Alpha Squadron hadn't been running coordination exercises at all. They'd been running full combat simulations against advanced threat scenarios, Russian-made SAM systems, electronic warfare countermeasures, and multi-target engagement protocols. The kind of training reserved for units preparing for immediate deployment to active combat zones. Her hands trembled as she cross-referenced the flight data with recent intelligence briefings. The pattern was unmistakable. Alpha Squadron was being prepared for a real mission, something urgent and dangerous enough to require compressed training schedules and security protocols that kept even senior maintenance personnel in the dark. As she dug deeper into the classified files her security clearance barely allowed her to access, fragments of a larger picture began to emerge. Satellite reconnaissance showing unusual military activity near the Canadian border. Intelligence reports of arms trafficking through mountain passes. Authorization codes for extended range combat missions. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Alpha Squadron was being prepared for an interdiction mission, the same type of mission that had killed 4 of her squadron mates 8 years ago. She thought about Torres and Barnes, their youth and inexperience, their confidence in training scenarios that bore little resemblance to the chaos of real combat. She thought about Webb and his casual arrogance, his dismissal of anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of what a warrior should look like. Most of all, she thought about the hidden photograph in her apartment drawer and the price of being unprepared when the shooting started. The sun was setting over the desert when she finally locked her terminal and prepared to leave. But as she walked past the F-15 Strike Eagle in Bay 7, she found herself pausing again, studying the aircraft with the critical eye of someone who understood the difference between flying for show and flying for survival. Tomorrow, she realized, everything might change. The storm clouds she'd been sensing all day were about to break, and when they did, all the careful invisibility in the world wouldn't matter. The ghost was about to be called back into the light, whether she was ready or not. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn silence at 0347 hours, sending personnel scrambling across the base like disturbed ants. Avery was already awake. Sleep had been elusive since her discovery of Alpha Squadron's true mission, parameters, and she dressed quickly, her maintenance coveralls feeling somehow inadequate for whatever crisis was unfolding. The control center was chaos when she arrived. Officers shouted coordinates and status reports, while technicians hunched over radar displays, their faces illuminated by the green glow of screens showing empty sky where aircraft should have been. Last confirmed. Position was grid 7-7 Alpha, reported Lieutenant Morrison, his voice tight with stress. Radio contact lost at 0334 hours. No transponder signal, no emergency beacon, nothing. Colonel Hayes stood at the center of the storm, his usually composed demeanor cracking under the weight of command decisions no one should have to make. How long since last contact? 30 minutes, sir. Alpha Squadron was conducting an interdiction mission against suspected arms traffickers near the Canadian border. Intelligence indicated light resistance, minimal air defense capability. Avery's blood turned to ice. The mission she'd feared was happening had already gone wrong. She moved to her designated workstation in the back corner, ostensibly to monitor system diagnostics, but really to access the classified communication channels her security clearance barely allowed her to monitor. The fragments of radio traffic she intercepted painted a grim picture. Alpha Squadron had walked into an ambush sophisticated surface-to-air missiles, electronic warfare jamming, and what sounded like coordinated ground fire from multiple positions. The kind of trap that required weeks of preparation and intelligence that someone had badly underestimated. Captain Webb burst through the control center doors, still fastening his flight suit. "Sir, Bravo Squadron is ready for immediate deployment. Give us the coordinates and we'll bring our people home." Hayes shook his head grimly. "Bravo Squadron is deployed in Afghanistan. Charlie Squadron is in maintenance rotation. Delta Squadron won't be mission ready for 6 hours minimum." 6 hours? Webb's voice cracked with disbelief. "Sir, those pilots will be dead or captured in 6 hours. We need to move now." "With what aircraft, Captain? With what pilots?" Hayes's frustration boiled over. "We have one F-15 in partial maintenance. Status and a handful of training aircraft aren't equipped for combat operations. Nobody else has the qualifications or the clearance for this type of mission." The control center fell into desperate silence. 2 pilots were missing, possibly down, definitely in enemy territory where every second counted. The weight of impossible decisions pressed down on everyone present. Webb turned toward the maintenance section, his eyes wild with desperation. What about support personnel? Anyone with flight training? Anyone who could pilot a rescue mission? Several technicians shook their heads. Senior Airman Rodriguez spoke for all of them. "None of us have combat pilot certification, sir. We're all ground crew." "There has to be someone," Webb insisted, his voice rising. "This is the United States Air Force. We don't abandon our people." From her position in the back corner, Avery watched the scene unfold with growing certainty that she was witnessing a moment that would define the rest of her life. The same sick feeling she'd experienced 8 years ago was building in her stomach. The knowledge that good people were about to die because the system had failed them. She thought about Captain Torres and Lieutenant Barnes, probably injured, definitely scared, hiding in hostile territory while enemy forces closed in around them. She thought about the families who would receive notification visits, the folded flags, the empty chairs at dinner tables. Most of all, she thought about Lieutenant Rachel Davis, a wingman from Viper Squadron, who had died in the wreckage of her F-16 while covering Avery's retreat from their own ambush 8 years ago. Rachel had trusted her, followed her lead, into that trap, and paid the ultimate price for Avery's navigation error. The guilt of that failure had driven her into hiding, but watching another potential tragedy unfold made her realize that hiding was just another form of failure. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Every head in the control center turned toward her. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying. Clearly, in the hushed room, I might be able to help. Webb laughed bitterly. "What? You're gonna fix this with a wrench?" "This isn't a maintenance problem, Ghost. This is combat." Colonel Hayes held up a hand for silence, his experienced eyes studying Avery with sudden intensity. "What exactly are you suggesting, Knox?" She took a deep breath, knowing that the next word she spoke would end 8 years of carefully maintained. "Invisibility forever. I have combat pilot training, sir. Current qualifications. Valid security clearance. I can fly the F-15 in Base 7. The silence that followed was profound. Webb's expression shifted from disbelief to incredulity. "Are you out of your mind? You're a maintenance technician. You don't just wake up one day and decide to be a fighter pilot." "Actually," Chief Kowalski's gravelly voice cut through the tension. She might be telling the truth. He was staring at Avery with dawning recognition. "Jesus Christ, Knox, how long have you been hiding this?" Colonel Hayes stepped forward, his command authority taking over. "Explain yourself, Airman. What exactly is your flight training background?" Avery's throat felt dry as desert sand, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "Viper Squadron 2016 to 2017, 17 combat missions, 2 confirmed kills, 0 losses until—" Her voice caught slightly. "Until Mission 18. My call sign was Viper Hawk." The impact of her words was immediate and electric. Every person in that room knew about Viper Squadron. They were legends, heroes whose exploits were whispered about in pilot training schools. They were also supposedly all dead. Chief Kowalski was the first to recover his voice. "Holy shit, Hayes. She's telling the truth. Viper Hawk was real. I remember the classified reports." Webb's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Viper Squadron was wiped out. Everyone knows that." "4 of us were wiped out," Avery corrected quietly. "I survived. I transferred to maintenance and requested that my combat record be classified. I've been here 8 years, doing exactly what everyone thinks I do, maintaining aircraft and staying invisible." Hayes studied her for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 seconds. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of command decisions that could save lives or destroy careers. "Max, those qualifications are 8 years old. Combat flying isn't like riding a bicycle. You lose your edge if you don't use it. Are you absolutely certain you can handle a combat mission against sophisticated air defenses?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Avery thought about 8 years of maintaining fighter aircraft, 8 years of watching training flights and biting her tongue at dangerous mistakes, 8 years of dreaming about blue sky and burning wreckage. She thought about Captain Torres and Lieutenant Barnes, somewhere in enemy territory, counting on anyone to come for them. "Sir," she said with quiet conviction, "I never stopped being a pilot. I just stopped flying." But muscle memory doesn't fade, and neither does the responsibility we owe to our people. Webb stepped forward, his voice sharp with desperation and disbelief. "Colonel, you can't be seriously considering this. She's been out of combat for 8 years. This is suicide, for her and for the pilots she's supposed to rescue." "Captain Webb," Hayes's voice carried deadly calm, "do you have a better option? Can you personally pilot a combat rescue mission with your current qualifications?" "I know, sir, but ... then step aside." Hayes turned back to Avery. "Knox, if you're wrong about this, people are going to die. If you're right but rusty, people are going to die. Are you prepared to take that responsibility?" Avery looked around the control center at the faces staring back at her, some hopeful, some skeptical, all desperate for a solution to an impossible situation. She thought about Rachel Davis, about the other members of Viper Squadron, about the price of heroism and the greater price of inaction. "Yes, sir," she said simply. "I'm ready." The decision made, the control center exploded into activity. Hayes began issuing rapid-fire orders, while technicians scrambled to prepare the F-15 for immediate combat operations. But even as the chaos swirled around her, Avery felt a strange calm settling over her shoulders like an old, familiar jacket. For 8 years, she had been running from who she really was. Today, finally, she was going home. The hangar bay erupted into controlled chaos the moment Colonel Hayes gave the order to prep the F-15 Strike Eagle for immediate combat deployment. Ground crews swarmed around the aircraft like antibodies attacking an infection. Their movements, swift and purposeful, despite the impossibility of what they were attempting. Avery walked toward the fighter with steady steps, but inside, her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. 8 years of maintenance work had kept her intimately familiar with every system, every wire, every component that made these machines fly and fight. But familiarity wasn't the same as muscle memory. And muscle memory wasn't the same as the split-second instincts that kept combat pilots alive. "Knox." Senior Airman Rodriguez jogged alongside her, his face tight with concern. "Ma'am, that bird's in partial maintenance status for 3 days. We've got maybe 40 minutes to run full systems checks, weapons loading, and fuel top off. That's impossible even with a full crew." "Then we'd better work fast," she replied, pulling her hair back into the tight bun that had become second nature. But her hands were already moving toward the aircraft's access panels, fingers remembering security codes she hadn't used in 8 years. The F-15 Strike Eagle was a magnificent machine twin engines, advanced radar, capable of air-to-air and air-to-ground combat in any weather conditions. As she approached the cockpit, decades of training and experience merged with 8 years of technical knowledge to create something new, a perfect understanding of both pilot and machine. Chief Kowalski appeared at her shoulder, his weathered hands carrying a flight helmet painted with faded letters. Viper Hawk. The sight of it made her breath catch in her throat. "Found this in storage," he said gruffly. "Figured you might want it back." She took the helmet with trembling fingers. The weight was exactly as she remembered, not just the physical weight of Kevlar and electronics, but the psychological weight of responsibility for million-dollar aircraft and the lives that depended on their successful missions. "Chief, I need to ask you something," she said quietly, aware that ground crews were listening even as they worked. "Do you think I'm making a mistake? 8 years is a long time to be away from combat flying." Kowalski's eyes, hard as desert stone, softened slightly. "Knox, I've been in this Air Force since before most of these kids were born. I've seen pilots who could fly anything but couldn't handle the pressure when it mattered. I've seen others who maybe weren't the smoothest in training but had something special when the shooting started." He paused, studying her face. "What you did 8 years ago, saving what was left of your squadron after that ambush, that wasn't luck. That was skill and character under pressure. 4 good pilots died under my command. 4 good pilots died in an impossible situation. You brought yourself home and learned from it. That's what combat pilots do. They survive, they learn, and they're ready when their people need them again." The weapons crew finished loading AIM-120 MREM missiles and AIM-9 Sidewinders into the aircraft's hardpoints. The fuel truck disconnected from the fighter's tanks, leaving her with maximum range and endurance. Every system showed green on the diagnostic displays. Captain Webb approached as she began her pre-flight inspection, his face a mixture of skepticism and barely controlled anxiety. "Knox, I want to be clear about something. If you're wrong about this, if you can't handle what you're walking into, you're not just risking your own life. Torres and Barnes are counting on you." She looked up from the engine intake she was examining. "Captain, I appreciate your concern. But right now, I'm the only option those pilots have. Question is, are you going to help me get them home, or are you going to keep reminding me how dangerous this is? He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. What do you need? Intelligence briefing. Everything we know about the threat environment, enemy capabilities, terrain features. I need to understand what I'm flying into before I get there. The next 20 minutes were a blur of tactical information, satellite photos, and threat assessments. The picture that emerged was sobering. Alpha Squadron had been ambushed by a well-coordinated enemy force with sophisticated air defense systems and detailed knowledge of American flight patterns. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned trap. The good news, reported Lieutenant Morrison, is that we're intercepting enemy radio traffic suggesting they're conducting ground searches rather than celebrating confirmed kills. That means Torres and Barnes probably ejected successfully and are evading capture. The bad news, Colonel Hayes added, is that the enemy has multiple search teams with vehicles and air support. If our people are on the ground, they won't stay hidden long. Avery studied the tactical display, her mind automatically calculating flight paths, fuel consumption, and weapons employment scenarios. The methodical analysis felt like slipping into an old, comfortable uniform. Everything fit exactly as it should. Sir, I recommend a low-level approach using terrain masking to avoid radar detection. Come in from the east, where the mountains provide natural cover. Establish air superiority by eliminating their mobile SAM sites, then provide close air support for the rescue operation. Hayes nodded approvingly. Textbook approach. But textbook doesn't account for the fact that you'll be flying alone against multiple targets in hostile territory. Actually, sir, she said with growing confidence, being alone might be an advantage. One aircraft is harder to detect and track than a full squadron. I can use speed and surprise to offset their numerical advantage. As she spoke, Avery realized that the fear and uncertainty she'd been carrying were transforming into something else entirely, the cold, calculating focus that had made her one of the Air Force's most effective combat pilots. The ghost was becoming real again. Sergeant Patterson appeared with a flight suit in Avery's size, along with survival gear and emergency equipment. Figured you might need these, she said with a grin. Give him hell, Viperhawk. The nickname, spoken with respect rather than mockery, sent a thrill through Avery's chest. For 8 years, she'd been Ghost, or Knox, or sometimes just maintenance. Hearing her call sign again felt like coming back to life. She changed quickly in a nearby equipment room, the flight suit fitting as if it had been waiting for her all these years. The survival vest, G-suit, and helmet completed the transformation. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw a maintenance technician hiding from her past. She saw a combat pilot preparing for war. The walk back to the F-15 felt different now. Ground crews stepped aside respectfully, offering thumbs-up gestures and words of encouragement. Even Captain Webb, despite his earlier skepticism, was helping with final systems checks. All green across the board, he reported as she approached the cockpit. Weapons systems armed, navigation programmed, communications frequencies loaded. She's ready to fly and fight. Avery climbed into the cockpit with fluid motions that surprised her. 8 years of watching other pilots had kept the movements fresh in her muscle memory. The seat adjusted automatically to her body dimensions. The heads-up display activated, and suddenly she was home in a way that no apartment or barracks had ever provided. Her hands found the controls without conscious thought: throttles, stick, defensive systems, weapons selectors. Everything was exactly where it should be, responding to her touch like a perfectly tuned instrument. Control tower, this is Viperhawk requesting immediate takeoff clearance for combat sortie. Colonel Hayes' voice crackled through her headset. Viperhawk, you are cleared for immediate departure. Bring our people home. Copy that. Control. Viperhawk is going to war. The twin engines spooled up with a rising howl that seemed to shake the entire hangar. As she taxied toward the runway, Avery felt the last 8 years of hiding fall away like discarded coveralls. She was no longer the ghost in silver maintenance gear. She was Viperhawk, combat pilot, guardian of the sky. And somewhere in hostile territory, 2 of her people were waiting for her to prove that legends never really die. They just wait for the right moment to fly again. The F-15 Strike Eagle roared down the runway with afterburners blazing, the twin engines pushing 40,000 pounds of thrust against the desert air. Avery pulled back on the stick and felt the familiar sensation of Earth falling away beneath. Not just physically, but spiritually. For the first time in 8 years, she was complete. At 15,000 feet, she leveled off and activated the aircraft's advanced navigation systems. The heads-up display showed her position relative to the target area still 200 miles from where Alpha Squadron had gone down, but closing fast at 600 miles per hour. Control. This is Viperhawk. I'm airborne and proceeding. To target area. Request final intelligence update. Colonel Hayes' voice came through clearly despite the distance. Viperhawk, satellite reconnaissance shows 6 vehicles in convoy formation moving through Sector 7 Charlie. Appears to be a coordinated search operation. No air assets detected, but we're tracking possible mobile SAM sites at coordinates 427128 north, 114 to 0407 west. Copy that, Control. Any word from our people on the ground? Negative direct contact. But we're intercepting enemy communications, suggesting active ground search operations. Enemy chatter indicates they believe the pilots survived the crash. Avery's jaw tightened with determination. Torres and Barnes were alive, but their situation was deteriorating by the minute. Every second she spent in transit was a second closer to their capture or death. She pushed the throttles forward, increasing speed to 800 miles per hour while dropping to 5,000 feet to avoid radar detection. The mountainous terrain below provided natural masking, but it also created navigation challenges that required constant attention and split-second decision-making. This was where 8 years of maintenance experience became invaluable. She understood exactly how her aircraft systems would respond to the stress of high-speed, low-level flight. She knew which instruments to trust, which warnings to heed, and which parameters could be pushed beyond normal limits in emergency situations. The radio crackled with intercepted enemy communications, Russian-accented English mixed with local dialect, coordinating the search for the downed American pilots. American aircraft confirmed destroyed. Pilots ejected. Beginning ground search in Sector 7. All units converge on crash site. Avery's hands tightened on the controls. Her people were alive but running out of time. She switched to the encrypted military frequency and contacted base. Control. This is Viperhawk. I'm tracking multiple hostile vehicles at the coordinates you provided. Count 6 trucks, 2 armored personnel carriers, and what looks like a mobile SAM site. Enemy chatter confirms Alpha Squadron survivors are in the area. Viperhawk, can you confirm pilot status? Negative visual on pilots yet, but enemy ground communications suggest active search operations. They're looking for our people, which means our people are still alive and evading. Avery banked hard around a mountain peak and suddenly saw the enemy convoy below 6 military trucks loaded with armed personnel, racing through a narrow canyon road toward the crash site. Her tactical computer automatically began calculating firing solutions, but she forced herself to think strategically rather than reactively. This wasn't about revenge or showing off her skills. This was about bringing her people home alive, which meant precision over firepower, planning over impulse. She climbed to 8,000 feet and activated her targeting computer. The enemy vehicles were moving in tight formation through the canyon, tactically sound for ground operations, but a fatal error when facing air attack. They had no room to maneuver, no escape routes, and apparently no idea that death was approaching from above. First target: the lead vehicle, probably carrying the unit commander and communications equipment. Take out their coordination, and the rest of the search operation would collapse into confusion. Avery rolled inverted and dove at an 80-degree angle, building speed until her aircraft screamed through the air like a guided missile. At 2,000 feet, she squeezed the trigger on her M61 Vulcan cannon. The 20mm rounds tore through the lead truck's engine block and cabin in a burst that lasted less than 2 seconds but delivered devastating effect. The vehicle exploded in a ball of orange flame that illuminated the entire canyon. The convoy scattered in panic, but there was nowhere to go in the narrow canyon walls. Vehicles crashed into each other. Personnel bailed out seeking cover that didn't exist, and radio communications dissolved into panicked shouting. Avery pulled out of her dive and climbed for another attack run, her adrenaline singing but her mind coldly analytical. The mobile SAM launcher was repositioning, trying to acquire a lock on her aircraft. That threat had to be eliminated before she could operate freely. She approached from a different angle, using the sun's glare to mask her approach. The SAM operator was desperately trying to track her, but she was flying too low and too fast for his equipment to maintain a steady lock. At 3,000 feet, she released 2 GM-65 Maverick missiles. Both found their target with surgical precision, and the SAM launcher disappeared in a massive explosion that echoed through the canyon like thunder. Now, she could operate without fear of ground-based air defense. Avery established a combat air patrol pattern over the area, using her thermal imaging system to scan the rocky terrain for heat signatures that might indicate her missing pilots. There are 2 human-shaped thermal signatures hiding behind a cluster of boulders about half a mile from the burning vehicles. She switched to the emergency rescue frequency. Any American personnel on emergency channel, this is Viperhawk. If you can hear this transmission, signal your position. A weak but clear voice responded immediately. Viperhawk, this is Alpha 2. Holy shit, are we glad to hear your voice. We're alive but banged up. Torres has a broken leg, and we're hiding in the rocks about 500 meters east of what used to be a convoy. Relief flooded through Avery's system like a shot of pure oxygen. Copy that, Alpha 2. Stay hidden. I'm calling an extraction now. She contacted base control. Control, I have visual confirmation on both Alpha Squadron survivors. They're alive but need immediate medical evacuation. I'm maintaining air cover until rescue arrives. Outstanding work, Viperhawk. Rescue helicopter is already airborne. ETA 20 minutes. Can you maintain station? Affirmative. I've got fuel and weapons for extended operations. 22 minutes later, a rescue helicopter appeared on the horizon. Both pilots were extracted safely. Torres on a stretcher but conscious and stable. Barnes walking wounded but determined to help carry his partner. As the helicopter disappeared toward base, Avery allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Mission accomplished. People brought home alive. No friendly casualties. It was the kind of outcome that made all the years of training and sacrifice worthwhile. When her F-15 touched down at Utah Air Force Base, half the personnel on duty were waiting on the tarmac. Word had spread quickly through the base ghost tech was actually Viperhawk, one of the Air Force's legendary combat pilots. She taxied to her parking spot, shut down the engines, and popped the canopy. As she climbed down from the cockpit, her legs were shaking slightly from adrenaline, but her face remained calm and professional. Colonel Hayes approached with a crowd of officers behind him, his expression mixing relief, admiration, and something that might have been awe. Knox, he said formally, then caught himself. Viper Hawk. That was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. We owe you a debt we can never repay. Just doing my job, sir, she replied. But the words felt different now, not like the deflection of someone hiding from responsibility, but like the simple statement of a professional who had done what needed to be done. Like hell you were, Hayes continued. You saved 2 lives and completed a mission that should have required an entire squadron. I'm recommending you for immediate reinstatement to active combat duty. The Air Force needs pilots like you. Avery looked toward the hangar where her maintenance tools were waiting, then back at the F-15 that had carried her home from war once again. For 8 years, she had convinced herself that hiding was the same as healing, that invisibility was the same as safety. But standing on the tarmac with the smell of jet fuel in her nostrils and the satisfaction of mission accomplished in her heart, she realized that some people weren't meant to be invisible. Some people were meant to fly toward the danger when everyone else was running away. Sir, she said quietly, I prefer to return to maintenance, but I'd also like to request additional duties as a flight instructor. There are some things these young pilots need to learn that can't be taught in simulators. Hayes studied her face, recognizing the wisdom in her compromise. Agreed. You'll maintain your current position, but with expanded responsibilities for combat flight training. Fair enough? Yes, sir. That works perfectly. The crowd dispersed slowly, but the change was immediate and permanent. When Avery walked through the base now, conversations didn't stop, they shifted. Young pilots began asking respectful questions about aircraft systems and combat tactics. Maintenance crews sought her advice on complex problems they had never encountered. The ghost had become real, but she had chosen to remain grounded by choice rather than fear. The morning after the rescue mission, Avery arrived at the maintenance bay to find her workstation decorated with a hand-painted sign, VIPER Hawk's Lair. Below it, someone had taped newspaper clippings about heroic pilot rescues and a cartoon drawing of a hawk wearing mechanic's coveralls. She was examining the artwork when Captain Webb approached, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked suspiciously like humility. Ma'am, he said, using the respectful address for the first time since she'd known him. I owe you an apology. Multiple apologies, actually. I was an ass, and I was wrong about everything. Avery set down her coffee and studied his face. The cocky young pilot who had dismissed her as ghost tech was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he'd spent the night reconsidering everything he thought he knew about courage, skill, and what it meant to be a warrior. Apology accepted. Captain, we all make mistakes when we're young. Would you? He hesitated, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally. Would you be willing to teach me? About real flying, combat flying. Because watching what you did yesterday, I realized I don't know anything about what it really takes. Before she could answer, Sergeant Patterson appeared with a steaming cup of coffee and a grin that could have powered the entire base. Morning, superstar. How does it feel to be famous? Famous? Avery accepted the coffee gratefully, using the moment to process Webb's request. Check this out. Patterson handed her a tablet displaying the base's internal newsfeed. The headline, read, Maintenance Technician Revealed as Legendary Combat Pilot Saves Alpha Squadron. Below the headline was a photograph of her climbing out of the F-15, helmet tucked under her arm, with the rescued pilots visible on stretchers in the background. The image captured something she hadn't seen in her own face for 8 years: confidence, purpose, the look of someone who belonged exactly where they were. The story's already spreading beyond the base, Patterson continued. Air Force Times wants an interview. Some military blogger is calling you the Hidden Hawk, and apparently 3 different pilot training schools have requested you as a guest. Instructor. Avery scrolled through the comments section, finding a mixture of admiration disbelief, and questions about why such a skilled pilot had been hiding in maintenance for 8 years. One comment from someone claiming to be a former Viper Squadron member simply read, "Rachel would be proud." The mention of her lost wingman hit like a physical blow. She closed the tablet and handed it back to Patterson, needing a moment to steady herself. "You okay?" Webb asked, his voice carrying genuine concern. "Just processing all this attention. I've gotten used to being invisible." Chief Kowalski's gravelly voice cut through the conversation. "Knox, Colonel Hayes wants to see you in his office. Something about new assignment parameters." The walk to the command building felt different than it had just 24 hours earlier. Personnel she passed offered respectful nods instead of ignoring her presence. A young airman actually saluted, which left her feeling both honored and slightly uncomfortable. Colonel Hayes was waiting with a stack of paperwork and an expression that mixed administrative necessity with personal satisfaction. "Sit down, Viper Hawk. We need to discuss your future with this unit." She took the offered chair, noting that he'd used her call sign rather than her rank or surname, mark of professional respect that felt oddly formal after years of casual anonymity. "Sir, if this is about yesterday's mission, I followed proper protocols for emergency situations. My actions were within established guidelines for..." Hayes held up a hand to stop her. "Knox, you're not in trouble. Quite the opposite. What you did yesterday was extraordinary, but it also created some administrative challenges that we need to address." He opened the first folder, revealing forms she hadn't seen in 8 years, combat pilot certification updates, security clearance renewals, medical evaluation schedules. "Your current position as basic maintenance engineer doesn't reflect your actual qualifications or the responsibilities we need you to handle. I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to technical sergeant, with additional duties as senior flight instructor for combat operations." Avery studied the paperwork, feeling the weight of official recognition after years of deliberate invisibility. "Sir, I appreciate the promotion, but I'm not sure I'm ready for formal instruction duties. Teaching young pilots means taking responsibility for their development, their safety, their lives. Which is exactly why you're the right person for the job. You understand the real consequences of mistakes in ways that classroom instructors never will." Hayes leaned forward, his voice carrying the sincerity of someone who had made similar difficult decisions. "These kids need to learn from someone who's been tested in actual combat, someone who's made mistakes and survived to learn from them." The mention of mistakes brought back unwelcome memories, but also a growing understanding of why this conversation was necessary. Young pilots like Webb were making the same errors she had made years ago: overconfidence, tactical tunnel vision, the dangerous belief that training scenarios accurately reflected combat reality. What exactly would my responsibilities include? Advanced flight training for pilots preparing for combat deployment, tactical decision-making under stress, air-to-air combat techniques. Most importantly, the kind of judgment that can't be programmed into simulators. Hayes opened the second folder, revealing a proposed training curriculum that made her pulse quicken with professional interest. It was comprehensive, realistic, and exactly the kind of program she wished had existed when she was a young pilot making dangerous assumptions about her own invincibility. "Sir, I'll accept the position, but with one condition. I want to maintain my maintenance duties as well. Working on aircraft keeps me grounded, literally and figuratively. It reminds me that these machines are complex, fragile, and unforgiving. Of carelessness, agreed. Half-time instruction, half-time maintenance. Best of both worlds." Hayes smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. "Welcome back to the front lines, Viper Hawk." The afternoon brought her first official training session with a group of 6 young pilots, including Captain Webb. They gathered in the Flight Simulation Center, a high-tech facility designed to replicate combat scenarios without the mortal consequences of actual mistakes. She began with a simple question that immediately revealed the gap between their confidence and their knowledge. Who can tell me the most common cause of pilot fatalities in air-to-air combat? Hands shot up immediately. Missile strikes, offered one pilot. System failures, suggested another. Enemy fighters, said a third. Avery shook her head. The most common cause of pilot fatalities in air-to-air combat is situational awareness failure. Pilots who become so focused on one threat that they lose track of the bigger picture. Pilots who trust their instruments without understanding their limitations. Pilots who assume their training scenarios accurately represent combat reality. She activated the simulation system, loading a scenario that looked deceptively simple, a basic combat air patrol mission with light enemy resistance. Webb, you're up first. Show me what you've learned in flight school. The simulation began smoothly, with Webb demonstrating textbook technique in navigation, communication, and target identification. But Avery had programmed additional elements that wouldn't appear until he was committed to his attack-run electronic warfare jamming, additional enemy aircraft, surface-to-air missile threats. Within minutes, Webb's perfect mission had deteriorated into chaos. His communications were jammed, his radar was being spoofed, and enemy fighters were approaching from directions he hadn't anticipated. This is impossible, he'd protested as his simulated aircraft took heavy damage. The briefing didn't mention electronic warfare or multiple threat vectors. Avery paused the simulation. Congratulations, Captain. You just learned the most important lesson of combat flying. The enemy doesn't follow your mission briefing. They don't wait for you to be ready. They don't fight fair. She looked around the room at 6 young faces that suddenly appeared much less confident than they had minutes earlier. Real combat isn't about perfect execution of planned scenarios. It's about adaptation, improvisation, and making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information under maximum stress. Your job isn't to be perfect. It's to be ready for imperfection. The training session continued for 2 hours with each pilot learning painful lessons about the gap between simulation and reality. But by the end, they were asking better questions, thinking more strategically, and beginning to understand that survival required more than just technical skill. As the group filed out, Webb lingered behind. Ma'am, that was humbling and necessary. Thank you for not letting us stay stupid. You're not stupid, Captain. You're just young and undertrained. That's fixable. One more question. Yesterday, when you were flying that rescue mission, were you scared? Avery considered the question carefully. Terrified. But fear isn't the enemy of courage. It's the foundation of good judgment. The day you stop being afraid in combat is the day you become dangerous to your own people. He nodded thoughtfully and left, already looking different than the cocky pilot who had dismissed her weeks earlier. That evening, as Avery walked to her small apartment off base, she found herself thinking about the photograph hidden in her dresser drawer. For 8 years, looking at that image had brought nothing but pain and guilt. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered if it might be time to display it somewhere less hidden. Not as a shrine of the past, but as a reminder of the price of unpreparedness and the value of hard-earned wisdom. The ghost was gone, but Viperhawk had returned not as the young, invincible warrior she had once been, but as something better, a veteran who understood that the most important victories weren't won in the sky, but in the patient work of preparing others to survive their own battles. 3 weeks after the rescue mission, the base received intelligence that would test everything Avery had been teaching her young pilots. A terrorist cell had acquired military-grade surface-to-air missiles and was planning to target civilian aircraft departing from a major airport 200 miles north of the base. The mission briefing room buzzed with tension as Colonel Hayes outlined the threat assessment. Intelligence indicates a coordinated attack planned for 1,400 hours today. Commercial Flight 447, with 287 passengers aboard, is the primary target. The missile battery is positioned in mountainous terrain that makes traditional ground assault extremely difficult. Captain Webb raised his hand. "Sir, what about civilian evacuation? Can't we just divert air traffic until the threat is neutralized?" "Negative. The terrorists have communication intercept capabilities. Any change in flight patterns will alert them to move the missiles to a new position. We have one shot at this, and it has to be perfect." Avery studied the tactical display, recognizing the complexity of the situation. The missile site was positioned in a narrow canyon with limited approach routes, defended by multiple weapon systems, and operated by personnel who understood they were facing a one-way mission. "Who's taking lead on this operation?" asked Lieutenant Barnes, recently returned to duty after a rescue and promotion to Alpha Squadron's new leader. Hayes gestured toward Avery. "Viper Hawk will lead a 4-aircraft formation. This mission requires experience with precision strikes in difficult terrain under time-critical conditions." The weight of command settled on her shoulders like a familiar but unwelcome burden. Leading other pilots into combat meant accepting responsibility not just for mission success, but for bringing everyone home alive. It was the same responsibility that had haunted her for 8 years. "Sir," she said carefully, "I'd prefer to take this mission solo. Multiple aircraft increase the risk of detection and friendly fire incidents." Negative. Intelligence suggests the threat is too complex for a single pilot operation. You'll have Webb, Barnes, and Morrison as your flight. Consider it a final examination for the training program you've been conducting. Avery looked at the 3 pilots who would be following her into combat. Webb had improved dramatically over the past weeks, showing real tactical thinking and genuine humility about his limitations. Barnes was skilled and experienced despite her youth. Morrison was solid and reliable, if not particularly innovative. All of them were better pilots than they had been a month ago. The question was whether they were ready for the kind of mission that could turn deadly in seconds if anyone made a critical error. "Very well, sir. But we do this by the book, with protocols I establish. No heroics, no improvisation, no breaking formation without my direct order." The 4 pilots spent an hour in intensive mission planning, with Avery walking them through approach routes, threat analysis, and contingency procedures. She emphasized the importance of communication, coordination, and maintaining situational awareness even in high-stress conditions. "Remember," she told them as they prepared to suit up, "this isn't a training exercise. The missiles are real, the enemy is committed, and innocent people will die if we fail. But if we follow our training and trust each other, we can succeed without anyone getting hurt." 45 minutes later, 4 F-15 Strike Eagles roared off the runway in tight formation, climbing rapidly toward the target area. Avery flew lead, with Webb on her right wing, Barnes and Morrison trailing behind in perfect tactical spacing. The flight to the target area passed without incident, but Avery used the time to test her pilot's readiness through constant communication and formation adjustments. Their responses were crisp, professional, and exactly what she had trained them to achieve. "Viper Flight, this is Viper 1. Target area in sight. Multiple heat signatures detected at coordinates 427156 north. 1140523 west. Appears to be vehicle-mounted missile systems with personnel support." "Viper 1, this is Viper 2. I count 3 launcher vehicles and approximately 12 personnel. Looks like they're in final preparation phase." Webb's observation was accurate and professionally delivered, a far cry from the cocky pilot who had dismissed her months earlier. "Copy, Viper 2. Viper 3 and 4, establish high cover and watch for additional threats. 2 and I will make the initial attack run. Avery rolled into a steep dive, with Webb maintaining perfect position on her wing. The missile sight grew larger in her HUD as they approached at nearly the speed of sound, terrain following radar, keeping them below enemy detection threshold until the last possible moment. At 2,000 feet, she acquired target lock and released 2 precision-guided missiles. Webb followed immediately with his own ordnance, both pilots pulling hard left to avoid overflying the target area. The explosions were visible from 10 miles away, 4 brilliant flashes followed by secondary detonations as stored missiles and fuel cooked off in the desert heat. Viper 1. This is Viper 3. Threat area is neutralized. No additional enemy activity detected. Barnes's voice carried the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully, but Avery wasn't ready to celebrate yet. She knew from hard experience that combat operations often included surprises that appeared after the primary objective was achieved. Viper Flight: maintain formation and conduct area reconnaissance. Make sure we didn't miss anything. Her caution proved justified when Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. Viper 1. This is Viper 4. I'm detecting vehicle movement approximately 5 miles southeast of the target area. Looks like a secondary position we didn't know about. Avery's blood chilled as she processed the implications. Intelligence had missed a backup site, which meant the mission wasn't over and civilian aircraft were still at risk. Viper 4. Maintain visual contact, but do not engage. Viper Flight: form up on me for a second attack run. The next 20 minutes tested every lesson she had taught and every skill her pilots had learned. The secondary missile site was better. Concealed, more heavily defended, and operated by personnel who knew they were under attack. But the 4-pilot formation worked exactly as designed. Webb and Barnes conducted a coordinated attack that eliminated the missile launchers, while Avery and Morrison provided cover against ground fire and potential air threats. When the last explosion faded and the threat was officially neutralized, Avery felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with watching her students perform flawlessly under maximum pressure. Viper Flight: this is Control. Mission accomplished. Commercial Flight 447 reports normal approach and landing. No incidents detected. All flights cleared to return to base. The formation flight home was subdued but positive, with each pilot conducting professional after-action analysis of their performance. They had succeeded not because of individual heroics, but because of teamwork, training, and the patient work of turning talented but inexperienced pilots into a cohesive unit. When they touched down at base, Avery realized that something fundamental had changed during the mission. For 8 years, she had carried guilt about the pilots she couldn't save. Today, she had successfully led 3 young pilots through a complex combat mission and brought them all home safely. The debt to the past wasn't erased, it never would be. But it was balanced by the responsibility she had accepted for the future. As they taxied to their parking spots and shut down their engines, Webb's voice came over the radio one last time. Viper 1. This is Viper 2. Thank you for teaching us how to do this right. Looking at the 3 aircraft following her to the flight line, Avery understood that her transformation was complete. She was no longer the ghost hiding from her past or the legend trying to recapture her glory days. She was a teacher, a leader, and a guardian who had found her purpose in preparing others to face the challenges she had survived through hard experience and painful wisdom. The sky would always be dangerous, but it would also always need pilots who understood that courage without knowledge was just another form of recklessness, and that the most important victories were measured not in confirmed kills, but in people brought safely home. 6 months after the terrorist missile incident, Utah Air Force Base had become something of a pilgrimage site for military aviation enthusiasts and young pilots seeking advanced combat training. The story of Viper Hawk had spread through military circles and beyond, inspiring articles in aviation magazines and case studies in pilot training programs across the country. But for Avery Knox, the most meaningful changes were smaller and more personal. She stood in the maintenance bay on a crisp October morning, watching Sergeant Patterson train a new group of technical specialists on advanced avionics systems. The same hangar that had once felt like a hiding place now buzzed with purposeful activity as maintenance crews and pilots worked together with unprecedented cooperation and mutual respect. "Morning, boss," Captain Webb called out as he approached her workstation. His casual confidence had evolved into something more substantial, the quiet professionalism of someone who had been tested in real combat and emerged stronger for the experience. "How's the new squadron shaping up?" she asked, looking up from the diagnostic computer where she was analyzing performance data from yesterday's training flights. "Better than I expected." The replacement pilots from Colorado Springs arrived yesterday, and they actually seem to understand that they don't know everything yet. He grinned. Amazing what a reputation for real combat experience will do for a training program. It was true. The Advanced Combat Flight Training program that Avery had developed was now considered the most effective preparation for deployment to active combat zones. Young pilots who completed her curriculum showed significantly better performance in actual operations with lower casualty rates and higher mission success percentages. Chief Kowalski approached carrying a manila folder and wearing the expression of someone delivering news that was simultaneously good and complicated. "Knox, you've got visitors. Pentagon brass, Air Force Academy instructors, and some civilian contractor types. They want to discuss expanding your training program to other bases." Avery sighed, setting down her diagnostic tablet. The attention was gratifying but also exhausting. She had agreed to several interviews and speaking engagements, but her preference remained hands-on work with aircraft and pilots rather than bureaucratic meetings about program expansion. "Tell them I'll be available at 1400 hours. Right now, I have a maintenance schedule to complete and a training flight to supervise." "Copy that, but Knox." Kowalski's voice carried a note of paternal pride. "They're talking about promoting this program service-wide. That's a big deal. What you've built here could save a lot of lives." After he left, Avery found herself thinking about the photograph that now sat openly on her workbench. 5 pilots from Viper Squadron, standing proudly in front of their aircraft. She had finally been able to display it without pain, seeing it now as a reminder of purpose rather than a monument to failure. Lieutenant Barnes appeared at her shoulder, still moving with the careful precision of someone recently returned from physical therapy, but determined to get back to full flight status. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you again for the rescue mission and everything that followed, but also to tell you something I learned during my recovery." "What's that, Lieutenant?" "I spent a lot of time thinking about what happened during that ambush, what went wrong, how we ended up in that situation. And I realized that we were unprepared, not because we lacked technical skill, but because we didn't understand what real combat would actually feel like." Barnes paused, organizing her thoughts carefully. "Your training program doesn't just teach flying techniques, it teaches judgment, decision-making under pressure, the kind of situational awareness that can't be programmed into simulators. That's what saved my life when Torres and I were shot down." Avery nodded, understanding exactly what Barnes meant. The goal was never to make perfect pilots. The goal was to make pilots who could handle imperfection. Exactly. And that's why I want to stay here instead of requesting transfer to a combat unit. I want to help train the next group of pilots, pass on what I learned about the difference between classroom theory and battlefield reality. The request didn't surprise Avery. Several of her former students had made similar decisions, choosing to remain at the base as instructors rather than pursuing traditional career advancement through Operational assignments. They understood that teaching was its own form of service, with its own rewards and responsibilities. Application approved, Lieutenant. Welcome to the permanent training staff. The afternoon meeting with Pentagon officials was as tedious as expected. Bureaucrats and administrators who understood the statistical value of her program but missed its fundamental purpose. They wanted to quantify training methodologies and replicate results without grasping that effective combat instruction required experienced instructors who had actually faced the challenges they were teaching others to survive. But the meeting also brought unexpected news. Colonel Hayes appeared near the end of the session with a document that made Avery's breath catch in her throat. Knox, I have something that belongs to you. It took some bureaucratic archaeology to unearth it, but your original service record from Viper Squadron has been officially restored and updated to reflect your current activities. The document was formal, bureaucratic, and completely inadequate to capture the reality of her journey from young hotshot pilot to hidden maintenance technician to legendary instructor. But it was also official recognition of something she had thought was buried forever. Your official designation is now Senior Flight Instructor, Advanced Combat Operations, with full recognition of previous service record and current training achievements. There's also this. He handed her a small velvet box containing the Distinguished Flying Cross, the military decoration for heroism in aerial combat. The medal was beautiful but felt strange in her hand's recognition for actions that had seemed like desperate necessity rather than conscious heroism. Sir, I appreciate the recognition, but I'm not sure I deserve this. The rescue mission was just doing what needed to be done. Knox, you saved 2 lives in hostile territory using skills you'd maintained for 8 years without official recognition or support. You developed a training program that has significantly improved pilot survival rates. And you did it all while maintaining the humility to keep working as a maintenance technician. Hayes smiled. If that's not worthy of recognition, then the medal has no meaning. That evening, Avery walked through the base as the sun set over the desert mountains. The F-15 Strike Eagle in Base 7, the same aircraft she had flown on the rescue mission, was undergoing routine maintenance, its panels open to reveal the complex systems that made modern combat aviation possible. A group of young pilots clustered around the aircraft, discussing technical specifications with maintenance crews in a scene that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. The artificial separation between pilots and support personnel had dissolved into collaborative teamwork based on mutual respect and shared purpose. Captain Webb noticed her approach and called out, "Ma'am, perfect timing. We're discussing the integration of new targeting systems with existing navigation computers. Want to weigh in?" She joined the conversation, contributing insights drawn from years of both flying and maintaining similar systems. The discussion was technical, professional, and exactly the kind of knowledge sharing that produced better pilots and safer operations. As the group dispersed to prepare for evening duties, Webb lingered behind. "Ma'am, I have a confession. When I first met you, when I was being such an ass about ghost tech and maintenance work, I thought I understood what it meant to be a warrior. I thought it was about dominating, showing superiority, proving myself against others." He paused, looking up at the aircraft that represented both lethal capability and technological vulnerability. "But watching you, learning from you, I realized that real warriors aren't the ones who seek glory. They're the ones who accept responsibility for others, who prepare for challenges they hope they'll never face, who understand that strength comes from knowledge and humility rather than attitude and aggression." Avery nodded, recognizing in his words the same understanding that had taken her years and considerable pain to achieve. "The sky doesn't care about our egos, Captain. It only responds to competence, preparation, and respect for the forces we're dealing with. That's what I try to teach, and it's what you've learned to practice. As she walked home to her small apartment, Avery reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from legendary combat pilot to hidden maintenance technician to respected instructor. Each phase had seemed like an ending at the time, but now she understood they were all parts of a larger story about service, sacrifice, and the different ways that people could contribute to something greater than themselves. The photograph of Viper Squadron no longer sat hidden in a dresser drawer. Tonight, it would occupy a place of honor on her kitchen table, surrounded by new photographs of successful training graduates, mission accomplishment certificates, and letters from pilots who had used her instruction to survive their own combat challenges. 4 members of Viper Squadron had died in service to their country, but their legacy lived on in every pilot who learned to think beyond technical proficiency, to prepare for the unexpected, to understand that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Avery Knox had finally found peace with her past and purpose in her present. She was no longer the ghost hiding from recognition or the legend trying to recapture past glory. She was exactly who she was meant to be: a teacher, a guardian, and a keeper of hard-won wisdom who understood that the most important battles were fought not in the sky, but in the patient work of preparing others to survive their own moments of testing. The Hidden Hawk had finally learned to fly in the light, not for personal glory, but for the simple satisfaction of watching others discover their own wings. Some legends are born in moments of crisis. Others are built through years of quiet dedication to making sure that crisis, when it comes, finds people ready to meet it with skill, courage, and the unshakable confidence that comes from genuine preparation. Avery Knox had become both kinds of legend, and in doing so, had found something more valuable than recognition or glory: the knowledge that her life's work would continue long after her own flying days were over, carried forward by every pilot who learned to see the sky not as a place of conquest, but as a realm that demanded respect, humility, and the kind of readiness that could only be earned through dedication to something greater than oneself. The last ghost had become the first teacher, and the sky was safer for it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.